Okay, so for my capstone project, my thesis was the influences that James Madison dealt with in the War of 1812. So basically what I'm gonna go over today is the big idea, the primary and secondary sources, the sub-argument, and the so what, and then my conclusion of my overall project that I did. So for the big idea, I'm going to talk about my introduction, my argument, and the big idea relation. So for my topic / argument was that America went to war with Britain in late 1812. So basically the Native Americans aligned with Great Britain and neither side won, with the Great Gent being signed in 1814. The reasons and my argument is that James Madison was influenced to go to war, was the British Navy stealing the American seamen, and then the Native Americans becoming more hostile towards the westward expansion, and that majority of the Congress that wanted to go to the war with Britain. And then my big idea that was presented through this project in my paper was the big idea number 3 of America and the world. So the relation to my big idea is that he made a successful decision to go to war with Britain, and by he I mean James Madison, and all these influences proved to have an impact, but Madison's decision making was proven to be as one of our best presidents of all time, and that the Congress wanted him to go to war. So the majority of them were Democratic war hogs and did not favor Britain in the slightest, and this was done so that America was a superpower. So basically overall with my arguments, that kind of backs up my big idea by showing how America and James Madison's action led to the America's eventual status of a superpower. So my big idea, which was the number 3, and the relation to it, was James Madison and his actions, which eventually led to America being one of the greatest superpowers. So 2 for my sources, I had a lot of sources, but 2 that I used throughout my entire project and I thought were the most helpful. My first one was this one, which was from a book written by Donald Hickey and Robert Allen Rutland, and this helped with looking more deeply into James Madison's personal and political life during the War of 1812. So it goes back to my introduction and my argument of the American seamen, the Native American alliance with Britain, and the opposition to the American expansionism, and the political realm of the era, which was the War Hawks versus the Federalists. And this source proved that James Madison was a great president at the end of the war. And the picture that I used down below was how Madison seeks the declaration of the war, and he's like going against that. And my second source that I used, which was also one that I referred to a bunch of times, and you can tell by like the title how it says 1812 to 1817, James Madison's timeline. Literally, it was a great timeline of events that were leading up to and through the War of 1812. So like, for example, when the war was declared, the important events that happened, like the battles and the treaty that was being signed, and what was happening with the political realm at the time, and how Madison was reelected while being in that wartime. This created the Liberty Congress to shape my paper's timeline. And it was used throughout my entire paper, and this helped me kind of break up all my body paragraphs throughout it all. And the bottom picture that I used was the Treaty of Ghent being signed, so it was just kind of like overshadowed that. And then the top picture is when Madison and the government evacuated Washington, which was both used from that website of the timeline, which helped throughout my paper. So moving on to my third point of my presentation is my so what. So this is going to go over my explanation of the subpoint argument and why my topic is important. So first, starting off with my sub-argument. My sub-argument was James Madison was a small, weak, timid man. And coming from this makes it seem like this guy can't make up from this. Like if you were called this, I feel like you'd give up. But so people were saying this about him at the time until he committed the actions and proved he knew what was going on the whole time. and people weren't believing him until he did that. And then once he did, they saw how great his military foresight was. And the reason why people were calling him small, weak, and timid was because he was like America. He was still helping France instead of fighting Britain. So once he completed, once he stopped helping France and decided to take on that war and start fighting Britain, then people saw, oh, he knew it all along and he knew what he was doing. And so my so what, it's funny, my sub-argument and so what is James Madison and the War of 1812. So my topic is important because this war was so important to American history, and it's also not widely known about. Like, before researching and writing my paper, I knew nothing about all of this, or even James Madison presidency. Like, he's typically not a president. We remember that often, and I can say the same as not knowing a lot about James Madison. And doing this project really helped me get to know and fight for that sub-argument about him in the War of 1812 and what great foresight he had and how much of an influence and impact he was during these timelines of this topic. And lastly, my conclusion. So wrapping things up, I'm going to talk about the 4 things. So my first thing is unexpected learnings. And so my unexpected learning was James Madison presidency and the timeline through the war. So, and the Native Americans. So not only did I know nothing about James Madison or his presidential terms, I also knew nothing about the time period and its era, which I stated earlier. And I thought it was very interesting learning about the Native Americans' opposition to us and how they did not like us at all. And like the Americans, and their partnership with Britain is another thing I learned about that I had no idea about. And I also learned that the people viewed politics similarly as they do today, which is crazy that we're still the same as today, and that the media, how it really impacts politics in other forms like the military, and how we're kind of dealing with that right now. This kind of leads back to what we were going through back in the day with James Madison and the Native Americans and all of that. So moving forward, I would say a successful future. So being better prepared for the future, because now I have a better understanding of how America has came to be and how it's kind of different and kind of the same as now and back then. And my favorite part, which is kind of weird, was James Madison's weakness. This was my favorite part to write about and to learn more about, because I learned a lot about Napoleon and how he had a great impact on how the public and Congress viewed James Madison, as well as the whole entire War of 1812. And I thought this was super interesting, going back to why he was seen as such a not powerful man, a timid man. I thought that was my favorite part, was writing about and learning and looking at my different sources of James Madison's weaknesses and how Napoleon impacted that with the politics and like the public and the Congress, and how that was so influential of how James was viewed as a weak man. And my least favorite part isn't really anything that I went through, but it was being so specific for this project and trying to pick one part to focus on the War of 1812 and James Madison, because everything involved in this topic was really interesting. It was hard to settle on one point and break that down into this thesis statement. It was really hard to not have my thesis statement be so long and focusing on just James Madison instead of focusing on other things and breaking through my paragraphs. I thought that was the hardest part. But overall, that is the end of my PowerPoint. And yeah, that was my PowerPoint on the influences that James Madison dealt with in the War of 1812. Thank you.